So I've already seen a few of the submissions for today. There are some extremely compelling robots and some extremely compelling uh, spaces. And I'm really stoked with how this is all going. This is looking really really interesting. I think in some ways, today's presentation will be one of the least directly helpful ones for in terms of generating your graphics, but it might be one of the most helpful in terms of it might be incredibly helpful depending on how much relevance and potency it has. But it should, I hope that it actually has the most productivity relative to your thinking. One of the things that I've been describing is how much of our understanding of machinic integration and how machines will be likely, how they are being integrated into the environment, built environment. Sorry, just pulling up a few windows for me. How that happens is being manifest is actually largely inherited narratives around ideas of robots, but that are not necessarily ones about performance. They're not the inherited narratives about machines relative to people is more about a legacy of science fiction and less about or a legacy of thought rather than a critique of appropriateness or development of a novel and relevant kind of framework for how we integrate machines. This is not happening everywhere. In fact, many other aspects of artificial intelligence research, they're radically innovative in terms of finding ideas of performance and appropriateness. The built environment AI, and I'll talk a little bit about the kind of the tropes of this, but they're basically, you can think of the Internet of Things and the smart city as being kind of the two dominant models for how we integrate machines into the environment. That's their legacies and their our appropriateness their appropriation of machines are much more about fear, about inherited notions, that sort of thing. So today I really want to make an argument for alternative mechanisms for integrating machines into the environment, and this will definitely affect your graphics, but they're not necessarily it might not be as potent as sort of the robotic other aspects of this workshop. But it hopefully is actually some of the most potent things about suggesting observations of a material culture, observations of the world that we live in, and offering an example of how to kind of attack and deconstruct that in a way that's potent. So in some ways it's if this makes it into your drawings in a really meaningful way, awesome. But in some ways, it's more of just like, hey, this is work that I've done that I found a lot of meaning and use out of that may be helpful more for you as designers after this workshop than necessarily directly in the workshop. So with that caveat, again, we're going to be having the first hour and a half of this class will be here on Zoom. It's being recorded. Just be aware of that. Your faces and reactions and expressions are being recorded. So if you don't want that, turn off your video. But we will be continuing the course on Discord. For those of you who aren't registered to the class or have not been to the previous sessions, Discord is a gaming app that allows people to kind of share images and tutorials. Basically, the rest of the workshop will be people working on tutorials that I suggest that I think will help advance the graphics. That's open to everyone. Anyone who wants to check those out and explore and play around with them is welcome to join in. This is very much in the spirit of inclusive futures. So please feel free to join us after that as well, or after the presentation today. So while yesterday we were speaking about the robotic other and how this idea of robots and humans was kind of a product of generic thinking, that there's two genres of things, one is one is the other, that is being pressured, and is certainly not the way that machines are being manifest. There are very many cyborgs, humans that have machinic augmentations. When we extend machinic augmentations to beyond the realm of implanted machinery, but when we start describing ideas of the hippocampus being removed and being held by our iPhones and our GPS navs in cars and things like that. That this idea of them being two different things is being pressured, and I think it's worth noting that these kinds of generic pressures are sort of under attack in many corners of the world, in many places. Certainly here in the United States, the issues around gender and kind of this traditional notion that there are two genders and every human fits into either one of them, is whether you agree with it or not, is certainly being pressured, and is certainly uh, uh, pushing the way we consider that kind of issue, as well as many other kind of issues, into a non-generic kind of thinking of of there's this and there's that and there's no in between or other, and moving that into a sort of different space and a different way of understanding populations. Um, and there's certainly, I think, one of another sort of theme of the course so far that is probably worth noting is that there's incredible performative benefits to this integration of machines into humans and as well into the built environment. Um, Effectively, and UPS has been saving millions of gallons of gas a year since they decided, and I think it was 2008, somewhere around that time, to computationally instruct their drivers to take 3 rights as opposed to 1 left. Saves millions of dollars of gas, and while that's certainly kind of a heuristic that could be applied to human driver without computation, when you think about the complexity of roads and kind of the vast navigation that a UPS driver would need to manage, and their spatial thinking to think about not just turning onto the street, but how to position themselves. It's certainly not impossible to do it without computation, but it would be much more difficult and would have much less effect because there would be much greater human error. As we're talking about issues of nature, issues of sustainability, and research management, these are things that computers do incredibly well. Yet we're sort of siloed computers, and particularly in the built environment, to tools of representation rather than tools of performance. And it's created conditions that where we're not seeing their benefit. So in some ways, this class is a very much one of proposing a future, but proposing a future that suggests benefit. There could be, we're definitely have some seriously moody drawings going on, and I love that. But at the same time, like, there's ways to have those kinds of tones and still talk about how there can be an optimism, there can be a benefit. We can sort of create a better world that might not be one that's sort of like a 1950s cartoon of an American suburb, but one that, with like green grass and everyone's happy and all that sort of thing. But it could be, just how this integration of computation reframes this generic thinking, and then has environmental benefits that might be very, very local or very, very minimal, but there's still something green, something beautiful, something uplifting, and otherwise moody world, which I love that all their drawings so far are fairly moody and shady and all that. They're like great, they're so good. But somehow connected to this idea of generic thinking is and kind of an offspring of it is this idea of mind and body. And certainly this is a prevalent concept in the West. I don't know how extensive it is. I've been led to believe that parts of Eastern culture are really push against this, and I'm kind of glad to hear, because it's a very problematic dichotomy for me. There's this idea that sort of the mind could be transplanted into another body, and that there could be a capacity, if we had the technology, for us to put our brains in robots that scurry around the world and continue our cognitive processes in the exact same way. But there's certainly a lot of evidence to demonstrate that this is very likely untrue, which so bear with me for a moment, because this is actually going to much more structural issues regarding built environment, artificial intelligence. But I think that when we start to look to other models of intelligence, ones that are being presenced in the world, there's incredible kinds of understanding that seem to push against this idea that there's a mind and a body, and those two are different genres that don't collide. The orb weaver spiders have a capacity to, it's been suggested they have a capacity to actually think with their webs, sort of like we use tools to think and process, that they think as well. I'm not as aware of the validity of those claims as much as I am. I have seen research that suggests that the adaptation that a spider needs to display in order to successfully weave a web is incredibly high level of kind of engineering, what we would call engineering. That to be able to maintain this kind of condition of the lines never crossing, that being suspended in a functional position, in a location that's functional, and the fact that I guess apparently the majority of webs are being spun at night. So my understanding is that spiders have difficulty seeing in the night, much like we do. So they are actually really relying off of feel and tuning the weaving of their webs based off of the vibrations that they can feel the web, to know that if it's sort of sturdier enough, or it needs more reinforcement, or if it's connecting the right way. Really, really remarkable stuff. When we so we're expanding this idea to thinking with tools, we can also similarly expand this kind of idea that we think with our brains to other capacities, other places of thinking. We have it's a relatively recent discovery. It was in the 1920s. It was suggested that we have neurons in our stomach. This wouldn't be proven until, or wouldn't be accepted until the late 1980s. But the fact that the cells that we associate, or the kind of grouping of cells, sort of suborgans of neurons, are not only not isolated to our brains, but also in our stomachs, suggests that there is some kind, at least of, even if very minimal, some kind of full body cognition happening, where we're actually thinking with different, at least more than just our minds just up here. It's also worth noting that the idea that the brain is the seat of consciousness, at least in the Western tradition, is actually also relatively new. Apparently, for some period of time, it was thought that the spleen was the seat of consciousness, which I find fascinating. I have no idea why that organ would be determined. I need to do more research on that one. But the idea that there's this the seed of consciousness might be spread through our bodies is interesting. I've talked to neurologists about what it is that the stomach neurons do, and they've offered, managing digestion, because so much of our neurons are not sort of are conscious reflexing, but they're actually kind of computing sophisticated digestive processes, that there needs to be a kind of a local center of neurons in that space. But it certainly seems that there would be this kind of capacity, that this idea that we we experience certain kinds of emotions with our stomachs, that we're when we're intensely scared, intensely joyful, that there's all sorts of phrases in the English language about being sick to our stomach, or having butterflies in our stomachs, that there is kind of actual an emotional process that happens through those neurons, that is registered in that organ. It seems that would have some sort of connection, although I'm not aware of research that goes into that significantly, but certainly suggests a broader idea of cognition. There's also, and this is super contestable, but there's also an idea, it's been suggested, that slime mold has a capacity to deal with abstract problems without possessing neurons at all. Its tests and studies on slime mold have demonstrated that the slime mold has a capacity to solve mazes. So if you put food for the slime at the end of a maze, it will successfully figure solve the maze to be able to reach the food. It's interesting because I've also talked to more biologists about this, and being like, okay, is that really a cognitive process? And that is a big gray area. It can be sort of written off as sort of a reflex, that effectively there isn't much cognition, as much as just sort of sensing that there's a target and then growing towards that target, similarly to how a sunflower might be positioned towards the sun and rotate with the sun, or a tree grows into an open sunlight patch. It's been suggested that it's kind of more of an accelerated version of that, but it's certainly an interesting suggestion that there could be different kinds of cognition that aren't biological, or that aren't neurological in the sense of having a neuron. I guess I must have deleted the slide in the last minute, my bad. But there's also a suggestion that different kinds of trees, rhizomatic trees like aspens, trees that share branching networks, but then have different trees spinning out from them, will have they will that they communicate. They can identify threats, things like fire or other things like that, and be able to communicate through their shared root system by sharing nutrients that responses to those threats. So there is maybe not cognition, but certainly a kind of communication that happens through plant life. And it's not just aspen. There's actually a lot of examples of this that seems to be seems to suggest a cognitive process. I mean, of course, without without us being as sensitive to those nutrients, if the nutrients are language, and we don't necessarily have a dictionary for that language, and we're not as sensitive as other trees are, it's very difficult for us to kind of bring in that kind of to participate in that kind of communication and sort of test to see if that how sophisticated that cognition is. But it does suggest that there is some sort of awareness and some sort of recognition of an environment and a performance related to it that then allows this communication to happen, which is also kind of remarkable. But even if we're to move beyond this kind of idea of that there's neurons in places that we don't necessarily think of, cognitive processes happening without neurons, there's still really interesting suggestions about how entities that are comprised of neurons engage in cognitive processes. In his book in the early 80s, Douglas Hofstadter first suggested that we could think of an ant colony not as a group of neural nets, but a single neural net, that each ant serves as a neuron within a larger brain that then has capacity to compute small level problems that then the larger net is able to respond to. And this is an idea that's gained traction by biologists since, that and has led to some really interesting discussions relative to this kind of idea of scalability within a neural net, that there can be a neural net that is a neural network that acts as a neuron in a larger neural network that acts as a neuron in a larger neural network. And this is an idea called distributed cognition, which is an idea, a technical term used by cognitive scientists that talk about how individuals can collectively solve problems and address issues and engage in cognitive processes that are sort of that no one individual could engage with in the same way. And this is a really there's been some really compelling work done around this by Edward Hutchins. He's suggested that aircraft cockpits and battleship command centers, no, not brigs, that's the prison, bridges, battleship bridges are actually distributed cognitive processes. So we frequently abstract and kind of these narratives of how these things work, and our understandings of them is that there's one person in charge, and that it's for those of you who saw like Star Trek Next Generation, basically, like, it's like, Captain, we need to do this, make it so. Like, it's this kind of very hierarchical structure where effectively Jean-Luc Picard is the dude who's like tells everyone to do everything. They may make suggestions, but he's the one who decides if it's the right thing or not. there is an aspect of that in these structures. However, Hutchins' work suggests that there's actually that these individuals more act as different neurons with different specific purposes that then share information in a way and make collective decisions in a way that's not sort of a bunch of resources presenting information to sort of a central brain or a kind of or a captain, and that then decides what to do with it. But it's actually a much more distributed process that occurs between all the different individuals. There's the slide. I messed with this way too late last night and lost track, but that's the slide on the trees that share resources. Sorry. Anyways, the I think that this has some really interesting implications, because if we are a cognitive network that has a consciousness, and it's possible for, and we're not really, we really do not know why we are cognitive networks that have consciousness. And we're not entirely sure when other cognitive networks have consciousness. It stands to reason that there is at least a possibility that the collective cognitive networks of ant colonies, of battleship bridges, of all the individuals on Earth, all the organisms on Earth, could form a kind of consciousness. And this would tie into and explain the kind of Gaia theory, the theories of the planet having an awareness and a consciousness that we are all a part of. This is, and there's no real way for us to communicate with an individual neuron except fairly indirectly through chemical things, but certainly not of an intentional, much like the Gaia could not communicate with us. This is as new agey and far out there as I get, and as this course will get. It's out there, but it is worth considering at what point does consciousness happen, and what is it about the sense of scale that prevents collections of neurons, even if they're comprised of neural nets or not, having consciousness? So things to be considering, and possibly ways to work to balance the moodiness of your drawings with a little bit of optimism as we're working on these the next few days. So I want to kind of ballast the new aginess of the Gaia theory with much more concrete and pragmatic discussions of consciousness, particularly as a response to the built environment, through describing what I mentioned before, which are the distributed or the strategies of built environment called the smart city and the Internet of Things. They're essentially the same model, just really just kind of at different scales or different mechanisms of deployment. But they are incredibly huge. They're incredibly expensive projects, and their intent is to the intent of the smart city is to embed sensors into the entire fabric of the city, to have a sense and a knowledge of where individuals are at all times. This is done with the intent of resource management. The holy grail of the smart city is to be able to understand where its inhabitants are and adjust the climate of the spaces they are either departing or going to automatically. So you leave your apartment, it is no longer climate controlled, but if you work in an office, then your office starts to adjust to with the expectation of you showing up. Right. So this is done in a way that's a little problematic, and this is kind of a big chunk of my research, where the idea of the smart city is that the first step is to collect information about how humans use a city and use a built environment, compile all that information, and present it to humans to be able to then determine what kinds of actions would be best deployed. The vast majority of smart cities are focused on creating nerve endings, sensors that record information and collect it and then present it to a central server, effectively a brain. But there aren't muscles. They're incredibly limited, but the emphasis is on the nerve system and the collection, so that the brain can process information, and then the muscles can be determined what to do. As an executive of one smart city project in Rio de Janeiro said, once you have the information, you're halfway to smart. So this is this can be understood as creating predictive responses to a deterministic system. Cities and how people interact with them have, to this point, have resisted simulation. We have not been able to simulate cities, and this is something every time I mention this, there's always at least one person who says, well, yeah, we don't have the data yet, but we will. And that's a very common belief, and I certainly don't discourage it. However, there is a large, rich discussion in cybernetics and computer science relative to the capacity for computers to predict deterministic systems, and in particular, and that there's a certain level of complexity at some point. The machines that we have right now do not have a capacity to simulate certain kinds of systems. If you are skeptical about the position, consider the water dripping from a faucet. This is a system that we cannot simulate with and accurately predict with a computer. It's incredibly common. It's incredibly prevalent. It's just simply non-deterministic and stochastic. I work with a civil engineer here at UNM who builds massive, like 40-foot long models to basically determine what designs of different kind of hydraulic features, which ones will be successful and which ones will work, because you cannot do it in a computer simulation. The fluid dynamics of water is not predictable by machines. This actually extends to far more kinds of systems than we would think. So if one can accept that maybe a machine can't simulate everything, and I'm sure there's things we can think of that we're just okay with. There's kind of we're very okay with exceptions to the rule. Kind of collectively, we're like, well, yeah, this is the rule, but there are exceptions, which to me makes it a bad rule, and not necessarily, because then how do you know if something is an exception or not? In this case, if we can accept that there's certain kinds of things that aren't predictable, and there are quite a lot of very, very good suggestions about how simulating human interaction in a built environment, whether it's vehicular traffic or choosing which destinations to go to, when, those sorts of things, that they might not be systems that we can actually simulate. So to pressure, if that's a pressure on this kind of approach towards the smart city, then it seems that we should be looking towards alternative models that in ways of thinking that would integrate artificial intelligence within the built environment. And if we're looking at and there's a lot of benefit of the breaking systems into different components and actually having them actually serve as neurons within the larger net, to break the neurons up outside of the server and embed them in the environment so they can operate locally, but then also suggest things on a larger scale. It's a very, very viable approach, but it's very interesting to consider, what does that mean spatially? If we're taking machines and splitting them all up, and arguably all of our computers that are connected to the internet are already computing things in different ways as part of a larger network, but they're physically located in different locations. If we're to break up the machine and spread it around and have clusters of neural nets that are serving as neurons that serve as a larger neural net, what does that do spatially? And this is an idea that David Jemison and Julian Pick addressed in their Too Smart City project, which was effectively these kind of cute sketches of the city sort of rebelling, that if someone sits on a bench too long, the bench would kick them out. If someone is integrating with if they're dawdling too long, that they with a camera, they would be told not to move along. The trash can would occasionally spit trash back out at the person who threw it away. These kinds of things are super compelling and really interesting provocations, but they speak to a larger dynamic, which has to do with this idea of simulation. Nicholas Negroponte suggested back in the 70s that there's an idea that he was saying that an elevator suggests an embedded artificial intelligence within the built environment, that there's an intelligence that the elevator can respond to a button, move to that level, pick someone up, and then move to another level. That's kind of an adaptation and performance that is much more akin to sort of how biologists view intelligence, through adapting and performing relative to stimulus within the environment. And he contrasted that to the way that we think about transit in most cities or municipalities. When we think about buses and trains, we kind of take the needs of a city, abstract them, determine when would be good times to we determine how to provide transit service to them, and then create a very specific model. So there's there's a lot of very intelligent decisions placed in this. There's more people moving through a city during the day than at night. There's possibly, if people in that city start work at 9 o'clock in the morning, then there's going to be a lot of people moving around before 9 o'clock. And these kinds of needs are abstracted, determined, and then addressed through the model that's created through these systems. If we compare that to providing transit, the way that Uber or Lyft or other network transportation services do it, it's much more similar to the method of the elevator. So when someone needs a car, or needs a vehicle, they effectively call the vehicle, it responds to them, and then call the network, which determines which vehicle is closest. The vehicle then responds to them, and then they get their ride, as opposed to a very non-responsive model, which is I need to be at this bus station at this time in order to be able to take this bus to this destination. There's problems with Uber. There's definitely the increase in traffic in Manhattan is certainly an issue that needs to be addressed. But there's some really interesting aspects about it. When we talk about how instructions are communicated to the drivers of Uber, their heat map to me is really interesting. The fact that there's a effectively hotspots of increased ridership where if you pursue the surge, you get more, you get a higher fee for driving people around. It's really interesting because it actually, there's a lot of discussion on Uber driver forums about whether or not you should pursue the surge. So if there's a surge somewhere, does that mean that you should actually drive there to pick people up? What I love about this is it's a very much of a heuristic mode of conveying instructions rather than an algorithm. So an algorithmic mode approach would be like, okay, driver, if there is a surge area, you are to go to surge primarily. If it's over full, then you may go here, then you may go there, you may go there. You know, it kind of actually creates very specific set of instructions of what to do. A heuristic approach allows the driver to use their own intelligence and their own experience that they've gained through either driving around the city or driving for Uber or following the surge, not following the surge, that they get a sense of if it's a good thing to do or not, and they can follow that sense. And really the judgment is on whether or not. So it's a very different kind of model. It's super interesting. I see the smart city as being really similar to the Internet of Things. I mentioned that before. One model and potential of the Internet of Things is the capacity for the thing, the object, to actually start to have muscles, to have oxygen. The vast majority of Internet of Things objects, like smart refrigerators and smart trash cans and things like that, all they do is they sense when they're full or there's gross food in it or something like that, and then let you know to do something. It's not like they're taking out the trash or purging milk that's gone bad. The Nest, although it has a capacity to, even though it's not localized cognition, it does suggest a model of how a thermostat may be able to start to cognate and start to respond to a vast array of complex behaviors and environmental conditions, both external to the building and internal, that could be incredibly successful. And this is it's worth noting that while smart cities are extremely expensive and want to track their users and adjust the climate accordingly, the Nest is relatively inexpensive and does this. You can sync the Nest up to a smart car or a smartphone to track your location, and it will adjust the temperature of your environment based off of your location. And just to close, this idea of this integration has been abstracted into this kind of amorphous light cloud, when really there's quite a lot of very sophisticated, very heavy infrastructure connected to it. So what I do want to emphasize is, as we work today to start to bring sensors and other kinds of muscles into your drawings, to be thinking about what would these entities need. If you're displaying a robot, how does it gather energy? Does it have an energy collector or producer on its body, or does it dock with something that then charges it up? If there are if we are breaking robots into different pieces, which parts and pieces of the robot would be where, and would there be kind of not only some sort of um, mechanical connection between them, but also an aesthetic one? Would a robot be able to would you be able to determine which robot's parts are where based off of a sort of an aesthetic strategy of what um, visual cues are connected with that machine? Um, and this very much ties into the heaviness that Ben Bratton describes in the stack, that there is a huge amount of infrastructure, the largest infrastructure that we've created to support this kind of communication, these kinds of tools. And is there a way to make them visible within your drawings to be able to show this and create awareness to the heaviness of the cloud, the heaviness of all of this infrastructure that allows us to share pictures of cats and things like that. So the exercises today are going to be a lot more general, but I would just and they're not, I think I need to create some tutorials on how to use Photoshop to create sensors. But just if you want to start fragments, when you're starting to fragment your machines or aspects of a machine into your built environment, refer back to the exercises from yesterday. This idea that a camcorder can become the head of a robot is really potent, but it doesn't have to just be the head of the robot. It could also be a dislocated eye or some sort of port for the robot to dock with, or something else like that. Definitely, the more you can leverage these kinds of details and aesthetic intricacies, the stronger your drawings will be. I'm speeding up a little bit because my headphones are telling me that they're about to run out of batteries. I apologize if my voice has gotten a little garbly. But we will be switching over to Discord. Before we do, are there any questions? Well, I encourage everyone who's listening at this point to go to this Discord link, join us there. I'll be posting Photoshop tutorials for everyone to experiment and develop their Photoshop skills with. I'll be going through the excellent renderings that have been submitted. And then we'll be moving on. We'll be developing the further. Joe, another great question from Joe. Thank you so much. How can we integrate these concepts into our image? I think that's really going to depend on your image, and I think it's going to really depend on what you want to presence. It's really, in some ways, conceptually, the easy part is to find a context that's compelling, and then put machines in it, and then these are very striking images. But as we start to get into the pushing on the notions that we have of machinic intelligence and tying into these concepts, it's really going to be a much more specific response I'll definitely, when I give you guys all critiques, I'll definitely be very specific about different ways you might be able to address that. But in terms of how, kind of a general suggestion, I would just offer that, thinking about what you've kind of, in a way, taking a step back at your image and being like, okay, what are these machines? What do they need? What would they benefit from? What are their purposes? That might help lead you into a way of starting to break these things up. One thing that is always super helpful when you're adding entourage, and that's kind of the fancy word for just throwing people in a rendering, human people or machinic people in a rendering, is to always have a story. It doesn't have to be an elaborate story. It could be, two friends are standing by the fountain and they're talking, or that this someone's needs to go somewhere and they're um frequently I'll see with a lot of my students, they'll just drop human bodies in there, and like, it's kind of like they're like all mismatched, and they're just, just that there's no real reason for them to, it's hard to understand a reason why they might be in the positions they are in or interfacing with the environment in the way that they do. To take that on with your machines, and as you put it in there, be like, okay, what are they doing there? Why would they be in this space? That'll help drive the space, because then you'll be like, okay, maybe I can actually show this aspect of the space more. Maybe it'll help drive the design of the machines a little bit, but it also should start to suggest, okay, well, if that's a place where they go to sort of recharge, then there should be like things that help them recharge everywhere. If that's where they go to um, murder humans, then yeah, dead bodies. I don't think we should do that. But like that would be a story. I don't think that's a good story. It's just a story. But like, that, like that, thinking of these as a narrative, thinking of these as telling a moment of a story that actually wants to like that basically is going to make someone be like, that's got to be a movie. I'm going to make that a movie. You're going to be the director. Like that kind of thing is what we're shooting for, even though, I mean, I love it. If that happened, that'd be great. So let's shoot for that. Like, and all of you guys are gonna get movie deals from this concept image. It's gonna be so amazing. You're all gonna be Hollywood directors at the end of this. But the thing is how do you add that kind of intrigue and that kind of, and that kind of thing, like the sense that there's something happening there that you'd want to see the whole film for. That happens through very specific positioning and intentionality of describing a dynamic that's happening. So to show that, okay, this is where robots go to recharge, then there's like, okay, what position are they in? What infrastructure do they need? How can we tell that that's a place to recharge and another place in the distance not a place to recharge? Something like that. I'm not even sure if the recharge idea is even that much better than killing humans. It's probably not, but like something along those lines, and whatever that story is would be good. Does that answer your question, Joe? Awesome. Cool. Other questions? Okay. Let's break for now before my headphones crap out. And I'll respond to all of your images, and give you feedback and suggestions about how they might be able to be, how that integration might be able to happen. Also, I'm guessing that there could be suggestions about story that is going to change the environments you've created and the machines you've created, and that's okay, because all of this stuff, it's not like you've like done one step, check the box, and you can move on. There's all like everything we do in the next few days will be a feedback loop for what you've already done, and that'll be constantly changing and adaptive too. So don't worry about it if you feel like you're not going back. If you're changing stuff that you've already done, you're actually very much going forward. So just keep that in mind. But thank you. Let's all go to Discord.